to 2 Corinthians 12:9. So when I first read this verse, I'll have to admit, I kind of was puzzled and I questioned God, how is this even helpful? So before I get ahead of myself, let me just read the verse. This is where Paul was discussing a thorn that he had in his side, and he had prayed and asked God to remove it 3 times. On the 3rd time, this was God's reply to him. And he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, my strength made perfect in weakness." Now, when I read this, I was like, God, I don't see how that is helpful. I don't see how, when Paul is asking you for this petition and for this request to have this thorn in his side be removed, you're just going to talk about your grace. It's like, it kind of, at first glance, it looks like God completely overlooks the entire prayer and just talks about himself. But this is what caused me to dive deeper into it. So I decided to study the word grace. And grace actually in this verse is simply translated into meaning kindness. And so God's reply to Paul was, "My kindness is sufficient." Sufficient is another word, a fancy word for assist. So my kindness will assist you. And then God goes on to confidently say, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." He was letting Paul know that in his kindness, he assists him with his own strength, that Paul doesn't have to worry about his weakness because God's strength steps in when he's weak. But the verse goes on to say that therefore I will gladly boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ rests upon me. So how can we overcome a time where our prayers are unanswered? We can rest assured that Christ's power will rest on us as we rely on God's grace. If you think about it, think about what Christ had to go through. I talked about how Christ also had an unanswered prayer. He prayed that the cup of having to die on the cross and what it was going to take for our salvation would pass from him, and God didn't answer that prayer. So when Paul is referencing the power of Christ rests upon me, and that's why I can boast in my infirmities, he's thinking of that moment when Jesus had to overcome that feeling of feeling weak, too weak to complete the task. So friend, if you're struggling with an unanswered prayer and feeling stuck, not knowing how do I go forward from here when I still feel weak or I still feel discouraged, rest in God's grace. Rest in his kindness to you, that he wants to assist you where you feel weak, that he wants to give you his strength where you feel weak. Will you accept that today?